Hey everybody, Mr. Barnett here. Sorry that I can't be there in person today, but I just want to make sure you guys didn't get too far behind. I know this isn't ideal doing it this way, but it's better than us having to scramble later to catch up. So pay attention as always, and also as always, make sure you're taking the notes. I'm going to try my best to go slow enough for everybody to be able to write down everything, but it's hard when I can't see you. So do your best to keep up, and hopefully we don't have any major issues with people not being able to get some of the notes. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So this is something I actually discussed with second period on Wednesday, but since I didn't get to talk to you guys yesterday, I wanted to catch you up on it. Basically, there are different ways that we classify how languages are related to each other. The biggest way the most broad, I should say, way that we define how languages are connected to each other is something called a language family. This is a collection of different languages that are related so far back we can't even tell where it started. This is before recorded history, and this is actually really cool. Linguists can actually go back and find out how languages are related to each other, and they usually start out by finding some words that are pretty common, things like dog or food or house, things like that, and they take those words and try and see where there are connections between languages. And if languages have more and more connections, they start to find how these languages are related to each other. The more of these things that are similar, the more likely those languages are related further back to a language that's more and more ancient. And so they might become part of the same language family. English is in what we call the Indo-European language family. It is actually the most spoken language family on the planet, with about 3 billion people that speak one of its languages. So that's a few. Basically like 40% of the world, give or take. All right, so the next way we define how closely languages are related, so if you imagine a tree for a second, the language family would be like the trunk of the tree, and then we have a large branch coming off. The language branch is a collection of languages that are more closely related, so they've split off from that main family more recently. They're related a little bit closer. So some of these are only several thousand years old instead of possibly 10,000 years old or even more. These are not as old as the families, and the languages tend to be even more closely aligned to each other in this one. Since they only separated 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or whatever, there's a lot more in common here. Even though they're related to those older things, the branches are much more similar to each other. So the Indo-European branch has a bunch of different the Indo-European family has a bunch of different branches in it. The one that we've talked about so far is Germanic. That's where English is. But then there's also Indo-Iranian. Indo actually refers to India, and Iran, of course, is Iranian. So that's basically between India and the Middle East is what that means. Then you have the Romance languages, and despite popular opinion, that doesn't mean they sound beautiful and romantic, like love romance. Romance just simply means from Rome. So that includes things that are Latin-based, so French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese. So some of them do sound pretty, but that's not why they're called Romance. And then there's the Balto-Slavic. Those 4 language branches are the most spoken of the Indo-European family. I mean, you think of Germanic, that's got English and German and a bunch of Scandinavian languages. So that's a bunch of people that speak those. Same with Indo-Iranian. Romance is a lot of people. So those make up a big chunk of the world right there. But we do have some smaller ones, like the Albanian branch, Armenian branch, the Greek branch, and the Celtic branch. The Celtic branch is almost extinct, actually. Greek has some speakers, but it's not a ton. Armenian and Albanian, they're doing okay, but they're not nearly as spoken as the other 4. Give you just another second to finish writing down all those names. I apologize. Hopefully you can't hear my fish tank. I can hear it loud, but hopefully you can't hear it. Okay, moving on. So the Germanic branch, as I said, includes English. This came from Germanic tribes that fought over England. They came over to England with their armies and their ships and all that jazz, but they also came over with their language. They basically ended up pushing out a lot of the Celtic people, but then intermarrying with the Celtic people. And that language, along with the people, kind of started to intermarry as well. So there is a good amount of influence from the Celtic languages within English, but the base structure of it, the biggest parts of it are all Germanic. Other languages in the Germanic branch, some of the big ones are Dutch, which includes several divisions as well. My favorite one is the Afrikaans or Afrikaans dialect, which is pretty cool. It actually was when they set up some colonies in Africa. The tribal languages started interacting with Dutch, and it formed a new language. We'll talk about more of that type of stuff in a little bit later in this chapter, maybe today. We'll see. And then there's the Scandinavian languages. So these are like the Swedish language, Icelandic, some of those that we consider like the Viking languages. All right, then the Indo-Iranian branch is basically two major groups. There's the Indic portion of it, which is Eastern. That's where India is. And that includes Hindi and Urdu, but Hindi especially, I mean, there's over 1 billion people who speak Hindi alone. So that's a big chunk of the the Indo-Iranian, the Indo-European family. A big bunch of them speak Hindi, and that's why the count is over 3 billion. And then there's Iranian, which includes Persian, Pashto, and Kurdish. What's really cool about these, it's interesting, is these are actually Indo-European languages, but they use the Arabic alphabet, which is not normally used for Indo-European languages. We'll talk about what that is used for later. But kind of interesting that they kept their language, but they adopted a writing system from another group of people. Give you just another minute to write these down. Kind of a lot of words that are unfamiliar here. Pakistan still uses several of these languages as well, Afghanistan. So even though it's called Iranian, it doesn't mean it's only spoken in Iran. Okay, I'm gonna move. Hopefully you're ready. Then there's the Balto-Slavic branch. This includes some major languages, but the biggest ones are probably Russian and Polish. There's a bunch of other languages that fall within these, and kind of have some decent numbers, but the biggest ones, Russian, Ukrainian as well, but Russian and Polish. A lot of speakers of those. And then the Romance branch. Oh man, don't you just love a good romantic comedy? That's not what we're talking about though. So the Romance branch includes largely Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian. There are a couple other minor ones, but those are the big ones. That's, like I said, that's why it's called romantic, because it comes from Rome. They do sound pretty and beautiful, but that's a different thing. That's not why we call them Romance. They're just from Rome because they're based off of the Latin language and have evolved and changed over time and separated from each other. The fact that French influences English so much is why Latin is useful for you guys to learn. It helps you to figure out kind of the roots of a lot of our vocabulary in English, because we have so much French influence from the Norman invaders into England. By the way, when you guys go on next year to decide what foreign language you want to take in high school, uh, some good choices if you want something similar that is not going to be too terribly hard for you to pick up. You speak a Germanic language, so German, or if you are lucky enough to find an option of like Swedish or Norwegian or something like that, that'd be pretty cool. But also if you learn one of the Romance languages, since you've had at least a little bit of learning happen in Latin, you could probably learn some of these. I know a lot of you are fantastic at Latin and some of you aren't in it anymore, but you have a little bit of knowledge on that at least. So that could be cool, learning Spanish or French or something like that. All right, move into the next slide. Now, there's something really interesting that happens with languages. A lot of times, Indo-European languages especially have it mixed with other languages. So they create something called a Creole. A Creole is basically a language, usually a colonizing language that mixes with a native language. So as these two groups, you now have a group of colonists that are living in an area that speak usually an Indo-European language. They keep speaking their language, but the natives around them are trying to trade with them, or they're being influenced by them or being controlled by them even. And they start to pick up some of the language of those people, and they start to teach their children some of those words and phrases and things like that. And eventually the languages start to meld together. So the people still might be learning their colonial language, or excuse me, their native language, but they're also learning pieces of the colonial language, and it starts to create eventually a new language where instead of those kids learning to speak their native language or the colonial language, they're learning this hybrid instead. And a big example of this is French Creole in Haiti. That's one that a lot of people just call that Creole. It's a mixture of French and some of the native languages there, but it is not the only Creole out there. Okay, moving to the next slide. We're getting through this, you guys. So we do know that all the Indo-European languages are related to each other through different similarities. We don't know for sure where they first came from, though. There's a lot of different theories. Some have it happening in Russia, some have it happening in Turkey, some have it happening closer to India, but not sure where it came from. We just know that they came from the same thing, the same place. It's hard to kind of track that because the writing system was developed later than the actual language, and some of that stuff doesn't exist. We can't find record of it at all. We may know more later, but for now, we just know that they're related, and they came somewhere between 7,000 and 2,000 BC. So it's at least 4,000 years old. We just don't know exactly how long or where from. So that's one slideshow. Want to get started on this next one here for you at least. Looks like I got some time still. 1 second. Okay, probably about 20, maybe 20 minutes if I'm lucky. Okay, so chapter 5 again still, but we're on issue 3 now. This is going to talk about some other language families. So far we focused on the Indo-European because that's what English is. But as you guys know, as you started researching your countries, a lot of your countries don't speak an Indo-European language. And so we'll get you some basic information on some of these other ones. The main big families are Indo-European, 48% of people, according to this statistic. I'm not sure how accurate that is now as things have changed. I think this number is probably about 12 to 15 years old now. So it could be a little bit different. But Indo-European, about 48% of people. Just write down the language examples for sure. So write the name of the family and the examples of languages. There's a big reason for that on the test. Some of those are going to show up and you're going to want to know what family they're in. But you don't need to write the percent if you don't want to. You can, but you don't have to. Then there's a Sino-Tibetan one. Sino-Tibetan basically just means between Tibet and the coast of Asia there. Mandarin is the biggest language there. There are several others, but Mandarin's the big one. That's 26% of people speaking one of those languages, mostly Mandarin. Then there's Afro-Asiatic. This is a really cool word, but Afro just means Africa. So that's where the hairstyle got its name. It's not the other way around. The Afro was made popular by African Americans, so they started calling it the Afro. Anyway, so Afro-Asiatic, that's in the Middle East, basically, because Africa, Asia, in between that area is the Middle East. About 6% of people speak one of these languages, but Arabic is the biggest one. Arabic's also a really popular second, third, or fourth language because a lot of Muslims learn it because that's their language that they practice their religious beliefs in. So it is one that people learn, even if they speak something else. People often learn that language. I had a student when I taught in West Valley who came from Chad. We'll talk about Chad later, but it's a country in Northern Africa, really. But he spoke a tribal language, a language from his area that his people were from, where his family was from. He spoke a little bit of Swahili. He spoke French. And by the time I knew him, he'd been in the United States for about 6 months, and he was learning English pretty dang quick, actually. He was really good at it for only speaking it for 6 months. And he also knew a little bit of Arabic because he's Muslim, and he was learning Spanish. So it's really interesting to find people who can just absorb language. It tends to happen in these areas where a lot of different languages mix because people are just, they grow up absorbing other information and finding their brain becomes kind of wired to be able to link different languages together and kind of figure out how they're different and how they're the same with the languages they speak. And it becomes easier. It's almost like working out a muscle. They learn one language, an additional language, they learn a second language, and it's pretty easy to learn a third or fourth or fifth comparatively. Something a lot of Americans don't really understand much because we usually just speak English way more so than most other countries. Utah's a little different just because missionaries, but still a lot less languages spoken in even in Utah than in some places. So Afro-Asiatic, Arabic is the big one there. Austronesian is another important one. This is about 5% of people. The largest group here is the Indonesian language. But there's actually a lot of different branches of dialects of the Indonesian languages, which isn't super surprising because Indonesia is a really wide spread out country that has like 2,000 different islands. And so they're close enough together to share a language, but they're also far enough apart that they started to change those languages and make them unique. But about 5% of the world speaks that. So if you look at the word Austronesian, it's between Australia and the Polynesian area, right? So those islands in between Australia and Asia is some of that, but then it also goes out further into the Pacific. Then we have something called Dravidian. The biggest one there is called Tamil. This is largely in the southern part of India, kind of the tip of India, but Dravidian. Then we have Altaic. This includes Kazakh. This is in Central Asia, Western Asia, that area there. And then the Niger-Congo family. This comes from between Nigeria, and the central part of Africa, which is the Congo area. The biggest one here is Swahili. About 3% of the world speaks one of these languages, but Swahili is the big one. We'll talk about that one kind of specifically here in just a bit. Give you a few seconds to finish writing some of these ones down. All right, 3, 2, 1. Not something as exciting as a blast off, just moving to a picture here. So this is a really cool map that I like a lot. It's kind of pixelated and old-fashioned looking, but really cool information here. You can see different language families where they're at, basically, where those are the dominant language. So you notice North America largely is that orange color, which denotes Indo-European. English, Spanish, they're all Indo-European, right? So that you can see there, but really cool to see up in the very top part, there's an other section, right? That would be some of our Native American languages, but they're not related to some of the other Native American languages. So they kind of differentiate them. They say this is other because the ones spoken up in the very far north are different than most other Native American languages. So kind of an interesting thing there. Then we have a bunch of different families there. One that, like we talked about, the Niger Congo, you can see that yellow one throughout kind of that middle part of Africa largely. There's a few that we haven't spoken about just because they're not as prevalent, not as many speakers. So you can see like the Austroasiatic there, that green one that's in Vietnam area there. Sino-Tibetan, of course, China, see that there. The green one at the top of Africa as Afroasiatic. So this really cool kind of graph or map, excuse me, that shows a lot of information. But one of the most interesting things is the Austronesian one. Notice it goes from Madagascar all the way through the Pacific. This is a huge range. And this actually baffled a lot of linguists as well as archaeologists and others as they studied language connections. This is pretty recent, actually, that we started actually connecting all of these languages together. Within the last 50 or 60 years, a lot of development has happened here. But we've been able to link Madagascar, the languages spoken in Madagascar, with the languages spoken all the way out into much, much further islands, even all the way into Hawaii and other parts of Polynesia. Huge range of space there. So Moana was right. They're voyagers. Check that out. They spread their language that far. Crazy. Read a book about it recently. It's really cool. Maybe I'm the only one who would think it's cool, but I liked it. Then we have the Sino-Tibetan family. These are languages of China, largely, right? Mandarin is the most used language in the world. But one interesting thing about this is they use something called ideograms, or some people call it ideograms. But ideograms are symbols that instead of making sound, like most of our symbols in English do, right? A is A, B is B, right? We instead, with ideograms, use symbols to denote meaning. So it's like a picture of something rather than a sound. We link together sounds to create a word, but in Mandarin and many other Asian languages especially, these symbols instead are words. So I had a student a couple years ago, maybe some of you saw this on the board. She wrote this for me, Oriana, if you remember her, but she wrote it on the board for me where there are several words and the symbols look almost the same, but with just slight differences. So the base of the symbol is identical throughout all of them, but then there's just a few little changes that make it into something else. So the base of it was animal. So it basically just said animal, but then it had a smaller little piece that changed to say animal, pig, animal, dog, animal, cat. And so you would be able to tell like, okay, this is an animal, but then you have to look at that smaller piece to know which kind of animal. Kind of an interesting concept, kind of a cool idea, but it uses these symbols instead. We do use some of these in English. They're not predominant. Most of our writing is through sounds. It's phonetic, but we do have a few things like the dollar symbol, right? You don't sound out the dollar symbol. We just know that that means dollar. The @ symbol is one that we see a lot. Plus the number symbol or hashtag, as you probably think of it most of the time now. These all have ideas that they mean. You don't sound them out, even if sometimes we try to throw them into words just to look cool or because we think we look cool anyway, like rappers using this number symbol in their name instead of an S. But they're not really sounded out. They're a symbol that means something, and we just inherently know that. But with certain languages, especially, for example, Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, you need to know, in order to actually read a newspaper, you need to know somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 characters just to be considered literate. Makes it, some of the things we're like, oh, I don't want to memorize some of these rules of our language. just imagine having to be able to read, you have to know that many different symbols, kind of very different from us for sure. So ideograms or ideograms, kind of cool thing. We do have a few plus symbols, hyphens, sometimes instead of just connecting a word, it could also be the minus thing, right? So it could minus something out, or equals. The equals symbol is another ideogram. Okay, I'm gonna move. All right, then we have the Afro-Asiatic language family. This one's really cool because one of the biggest reasons we have such an influence from this language family is because Arabic and Hebrew are both in this family, and both of these languages combine to create 3 of the world's major religious texts. So we have the Quran from Muslims, we have the Torah from the Jews, and we have the Bible for Christians that all come from Hebrew or Arabic. Those 2 languages are really closely related to each other, but end up with a lot of religious connection to that language family, which is probably one of the major reasons these languages are still around today. Hebrew almost disappeared for a while, but it's back. All right, then we have Altaic and Uralic. These come from Turkey and Mongolia, in between those areas. Big stretch of languages, a lot of land there, and different languages spoken in those areas. Many would argue it came from the Mongolian raiders that have spread it through those areas. Niger-Congo, I want to get to this one. This one's important. This is largely in sub-Saharan Africa, but Swahili is actually only learned by less than 1 million people as their first language. Less than 1 million kids grew up learning Swahili, but 30 million people speak it as a second language. This is because they use it to trade. So you would probably learn your tribal language and then later start to pick up the Swahili as you got older and you started to have to interact with people from outside of your village more and more often. Kind of a cool, interesting thing that happens. English kind of is the same way in some ways, but tons of people learn it as a first language, but it's also one of the most popular second languages because people want to do business with Americans or with British people or Australians or whatever. So they start to learn English because that's where a lot of the money is. Swahili is kind of similar, but in a much smaller area, just in that part of Africa there. Then we have the Austronesian one. I kind of mentioned this earlier. It traveled a long distance over time, but there's actually 739 distinct languages and dialects in Indonesian, which is pretty crazy. As I mentioned, islands contributed to that. Kind of like what we talked about with culture, right? Isolation creates unique folk cultures, but isolation can also create unique languages too. Okay, and that is it for today. Hopefully we're right about the end of class. If not, I'm sorry for the sub, because hopefully you guys will behave and be good. My suggestion with any extra time is for you guys to actually look at the Eastern European maps and maybe quiz yourself using your maps, or maybe even work with a neighbor, as long as the sub is okay with that. Anyway, thanks for listening, guys. I hope that I get to see you in person very, very soon, because we all know this is not ideal. But anyway, thanks much. Have a great rest of your day, guys. Bye.